Hello, welcome to another Alpha Bunga. I'm going to get these plugs out of the way right at the start. If you like what we do, if you're a regular listener and you haven't reviewed us yet, we'd really appreciate if you would do so. You can do that on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also We really would. We'd also. You can also review us on our Facebook page. If you don't follow us on social media, we're at Bungacast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and wherever else. As you're listening to this is a free episode. We also have a Patreon, and I'd like to take the opportunity, of course, to thank very much those who support us there and allow us to do free episodes like this. But if you're not familiar with the episodes that we do, which are behind the Patreon paywall, it's not just bonus content there. It's not just sort of scraps from the cutting room floor that we throw onto there. We only do kind of original content for the Patreon. So there's things where the three of us, Phil, George, and myself, Alex, discuss issues in depth. There's the reading clubs, there's the 3 articles episodes where we unpick issues on a theme based on 3 different articles that we each bring. And we also get regular guests on there where we get our close mates on to discuss stuff they've recently written. Last month
we had Amber Ali Frost and Anton Jaeger on separately to discuss post-work, universal basic income, all that sort of stuff into what I thought were really great episodes.
Yeah, and we plan to have more of that in the future. So what we're talking about today is the media, and I appreciate it can be a little bit meta or a bit narcissistic for a podcast to be talking about the media. We're not a podcast about the media, obviously, but it unfortunately plays a increasingly large role in our lives. We've done some episodes recently.
Yeah, Glenn Greenwald, another one with Amber Frost. I think it is an important thing to discuss, and to get a bit of an understanding of how it actually works. Break down the media, capital T, capital M, which hopefully we'll be doing a bit today.
Exactly, and I think probably the better that one understands the way that so much of what we do is mediatized, it helps understand what is real politics and what isn't. And I think probably the better understanding you have of exactly how the media works, and it includes social media and the things that we co-create and, the discourse that's created, the better we can understand where real politics might happen. And also where real, genuine interpersonal relationships might happen and how they might begin to matter more than they do now. So what we want to do today, I think with kind of 2 objectives, and this we're going to do with our guests who I'll introduce shortly. One is to try to understand the technical side of what is a major influence on mediatized discourse. So that is the algorithm. And secondly, to understand how this all relates to politicization, which is, George, it's something we talk a lot. We talk about politicization a lot.
I think it's one of the sort of founding concerns of, I guess, this podcast. Politics at the end of history. How, what's the effect of history coming back? How is that politicizing people? How do you get your eyes opened to politics, to the idea that we're not just objects, but maybe might at some point in the near future, possibly, hopefully, become subjects of political change. So I think really looking forward to the discussion. So, So just in a second, we're going to call up João Magalhães, who for many years was a journalist at Folha de São Paulo, which is Brazil's paper of record. And he's in London because he's finishing his doctorate at the London School of Economics on algorithms and politicization. His case study, as he'll tell us, I'm sure, is Brazil. But I'm just saying this now before we call him up, just to explain a little bit about why we've invited João and why we think it's an interesting case to talk about. Because basically there's many features here in Brazil that are very relevant to other places. So, half the population online, the other half is, and the other half that is very online, especially on WhatsApp and Facebook. You'll have seen it, with Bolsonaro's election, that there was a lot of fake news being spread through WhatsApp and, that being blamed for his election. We can explore to what extent we actually believe that's true. But we've also have the situation in which the middle class have become very politicized and very polarized since 2013, which is a situation that wasn't the case before. Again, also very strongly linked to WhatsApp and Facebook.
And Brazil is going through, as regular listeners will know, a very sustained political crisis. So all of that probably sounds quite similar to wherever you might be listening to this. That's why it's probably a useful case study to look at when we're talking about algorithms and politicization and social media and so on. Right, so we're going to call up João now. All right, so we've got João Carlos Magalhães on the line. Hi, João. How's it going?
I'm going well, thank you.
Yeah, so João's interested in democracy, and I've already forgotten what it was. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a sort of academic again, but it's datafication.
Datafication. Okay, so instead of diving into the question of algorithms, we're going to start with something a little bit more general, which is the phenomenon of blaming the media. And traditionally this has been, I guess, a little bit more of a left-wing thing, because left finds itself as by its constitution sort of outside of power, and so it likes to blame the media for political outcomes, likes to blame it for spreading untruths, for backing the establishment, and so on. But I think increasingly we're seeing the right doing this as well. So just to start off, what do you think of this phenomenon of blaming the media for political outcomes and for other kind of negative social consequences?
Yeah, I think you frame it right. It's less about the sort of a ideological side than it's where you are in terms of the establishment, right? So if you go back to the 1920s and the 1930s, the Nazis, they would blame the media for everything at the time, especially because they associated media with democracy and the Social Democrats. But yes, then after the Second World War, you have the radical left, especially. They in a way they still see the media not so differently, which is a little bit concerning, but not so differently from the Nazis. They see the media as incorporating the establishment. It's something that should be taken down. Or then you have, of course, Chomsky, who is the opposite, to be clear, of the Nazi, right? But who will come up with this, in my view, quasi conspiracy theory on how the media works and how the media structures the bourgeoisie society or incredibly unequal society. And I think when we were talking about the mainstream media, a highly concentrated media as it was in the essentially until the mid 1990s or until the 2000s, that argument, when it was well made, it made sense because, of course, the media is, and it was at the time, especially dominated by some specific and highly politically biased, I would say, political forces, right? But after the 2000s, that argument starts losing, I would say, force, because now media is essentially highly fragmented. So I think it's hard to explain how different actors in the political spectrum deal with the criticism to the media. So of course you have now Donald Trump doing that all the time, but he's talking about mainstream media and of course a mainstream media, an American mainstream media that is historically connected with the center or the central left, central right. But and this, in a way, I think it's, as I was saying in the beginning, it's connected to the fact that those actors are trying to portray themselves as outsiders, right? So because they're outsiders, they're essentially targeting the center of what they imagine is the establishment.
So just to interrupt, because it does bring something interesting to mind, actually. You know, I mean, a point that we're not the only ones to have made this point, but you know, the model of Trump is the closest model that he bases himself on is Berlusconi. But Berlusconi, you know, probably occupies that space that you were just referring to, the kind of peak, a point at which two factors kind of, there's a confluence of them. The point at the greatest stage of mediatization and mediatization of politics, but before its fragmentation. So before its fragmentation with social media and so on, in the 2000s and 2010s in our current decade. So you could, I guess, blame Berlusconi or blame the mainstream media for things in the late 90s, because that was a point at which the media probably had the largest influence at a time before it became threatened from social media. So it's interesting when Donald Trump does it, because Donald Trump does it at a point when actually the mainstream media doesn't have as much sway as it did. I mean, you're almost tempted to reply like, "Okay, boomer," but I really hate that meme, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's complicated, right? Because if you see those guys, they are not millennials. Donald Trump is a TV personality, as we were saying before. He's a guy from The Apprentice, right? He's a reality TV character, so he's a TV guy. But that's perhaps one of the ironies of the thing. So he got his, let's say, his clout, his power, or his ability to mobilize people from his persona, which was built again on the TV. But he was only able to become who he became, especially in the 2016 elections, because of social media, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that also points to the difficulties of making very clear distinctions between mainstream media or legacy media and social media. It's actually a really complex environment in which different kinds of media feed essentially sort of they cannot be understood as isolated.
So I think this feeds into a new kind of structure of argument when people are blaming the media. Maybe previously, and I think Alex's point about Berlusconi's, well made, that maybe in the 90s at that point, you blame the media. The media is quite unitary. It's these big newspapers, or it's TV. It's so you kind of can point to identifiable sources. But now when people blame media for political outcomes, it's often really blaming social media, and then it becomes a bit more disaggregated. The potentially the responsibility or the actors. And so that's why I think it's really interesting we're going to be talking about algorithms, because the explanation kind of runs through those nuts and bolts of how social media works in a much different way to you just have a powerful person who influences editors of TV and newspaper news. Now it's how is the news constructed in a fake way from the ground up, which is a bit of an interesting shift.
Yeah, no, yeah, but I think one of the interesting aspects is how people, in a way, they are still in the 1970s, they're still in the 1980s, and the way they criticize social media, they personalize it, and they talk about it as if it was as if they were criticizing the New York Times, or if they were criticizing CNN. So there's a lot of talk about censorship. There's a lot of talk about power concentration, and how some shadowy schemes are going on behind the scene to shadow ban, let's say, the left, or now shadow ban the right as well. And I think if you go back even, of course, as we're saying, the left, I think for a long time in established democracies or in the rich developed world, has been the actor that at the time mostly criticized the mainstream media. But of course, the far right always criticized the mainstream media as well. It's just that now the far right has so much voice that we are also listening to them. I mean, the far right is in power, right? So if a guy like Donald Trump, essentially, in my view, he's an extremist. He's a far right individual. So my point is that you're absolutely right in the sense that today things are way more complex than they used to be. And in fact, even in the 1970s, things were much more complex than someone like Noam Chomsky assumed. There has always been a huge simplification of how media works and what kind of interest makes sort of shapes the way media work or not. But I think people, they have a hard time making complex arguments. So
right. Yeah, it's almost like we need a critique of the media as well as a critique of the media, which seems a little bit like what you're advancing.
Yeah, well, of course, at the end of the day, it's academics who do that, right? Because people, they don't have, You don't see even how journalists criticize media. It's a highly simplistic form of criticism. But I think my point is just that they are still criticizing Facebook as they were criticizing the CNN in the 1980s or the 1990s, right? And I think this is highly problematic because it's obvious if you cannot really understand how things are and how exactly social media shapes politics, you're not going to solve any problem. It's very unlikely that you will be able to sort whatever problem is happening.
Okay, so I think it might be good because your academic work is very interesting on this. So it'd be good to maybe build the case from the ground up. So let's start with some of your empirical work. It'd be interesting to hear what you found about what people think about social media algorithms. So, do people tend to see it as neutral? Do they see it as biased? Who do they think is in charge? Do they blame people for what gets seen and gets not seen? So can you tell us a little bit about what you found in terms of the interviews you've done on this?
Yeah. So just a little bit of the background of my research. So as you said, this research was done at the LSE. And I think that in the beginning, I was essentially concerned with how Facebook, in very general terms, how Facebook shapes the way people talk about politics. Not Facebook as only a platform, but the fact that Facebook is structured by algorithmic systems, right? Algorithmic systems that define visibility, what you see and how you're seen by the platform and other actors. So, and I was especially interested in the Brazilian context because in Brazilian, and it was 2016, and it was like, what the hell is happening to this country? How the country that I knew was transformed into this highly politicized, incredibly polarized country. So I think, when I went to do my field work, which were essentially interviews with ordinary people, but people who talk about politics on Facebook, but they're not politicians, they're not part of social movements. They are just people who became politicized after 2013 in Brazil. And that was my first question, I think, which essentially, what's happening? What do you think is happening on Facebook? Because it was at the time, especially the academic literature was hammering down the argument on black boxes. Like Facebook is a black box. No one understands how Facebook works. There's this really complex algorithm that is making decisions and definitions on visibility. And so what's the point of talking to ordinary people? Because they wouldn't be able to explain you what Facebook is because they don't care. They don't know. And I think to my great surprise, when I went to do my field work, everyone has some form of understanding of how Facebook's algorithms work. And I think in my work, what I found is, like 3 different imaginaries. That's the kind of term that I use to define those understandings. So, and those 3 imaginaries, they are present all the time. So different people, they imagine that Facebook works in 3 different ways, and they will activate these 3 imaginaries at different moments. So the first imaginary is the idea that you have absolutely no control of how Facebook works. You might use your privacy settings, and you think that no one will see, but who knows? At the limit, the police officer might, find a way of seeing what you're posting. The second way is that, in fact, I can control, because algorithms, many of them would not use the term algorithm, but they will say that they know that there's a logic of visibility, which is that their actions are connected with what they will see in the future. So if I click on something, that thing will appear again. Or if someone talks to me, that person will appear again to me, etc. And the third one is something that's much simpler in a way. It's like, well, I have total control of what's happening here because I have my privacy settings and I can, block people, etc. So it's a really, at the end of the day, it's an incredibly, it's not that people don't know what's happening. It's that people have too many ideas of what's going on. and they have to navigate and negotiate those different imagined rules of visibility, which puts a lot of stress on people. So people are pulled to two directions. On the one hand, they feel that they have to become more visible, because if you're not visible, no one will actually see what they're posting. If no one sees what they are posting, they will not be heard. Their voice is useless. On the other hand, they know that if they become too visible, they will become the target of harassment, abuse, and all sorts of negative feedback, so to speak.
Increased risk of being cancelled.
Exactly, being cancelled. That's how some people would put it. Yeah. So I think my biggest surprise was how actually sophisticated people's understanding of Facebook's workings or inner workings is. I was not prepared for that. And that makes sense, in fact, because especially I did my field work in the beginning of 2017, and especially after 2016, algorithms have become a sort of, in my thesis, I call it a public secret. Everyone talks about the secret, and oh my God, how this is so secret, it's so complicated, but you have dozens of millions of people talking about algorithms. So it's a little bit paradoxical.
How would you place responsibility then on what gets seen, what gets created, the discourse in capitals? Because I think, some of your academic work, you discuss this question of responsibility, that do you blame the media for what rather the kind of social media platforms themselves for what gets seen, what doesn't? Is it people? To what extent are social media users the agents of what gets created as a discourse? And then there's also the question of filter bubbles, which I think we'll move on to a little bit after this. But firstly, just a question of responsibility, like who's responsible for the discourse?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's philosophically, I would say it's the hardest, because as we were saying before, there's a strong tendency to blame the platform, and I'm extremely critical of how Facebook works. But the way the idea of an algorithmic system is that the algorithm is just the infrastructure, right? So it depends on how you feed the infrastructure with your actions. So there's a logic, which is, you can call it an interactional bias. So which is exactly, we know how actually Facebook's algorithm works. We know that it depends on interactions. It's very simple. It doesn't go into all the details of how the algorithm works, but we know that without interaction, there is no visibility, right? So if no one likes your post, it's very unlikely that other people will like your post, etc. But going back to the notion of responsibility. So if you go back to the 1970s or 80s and 1990s, and how people considered the responsibility of media was that, well, the responsibility of media is rests in the assumption that the media is able to represent the word. There's a huge amount of things happening, and the media will not only select what should be shown, but also will show those facts in a certain way. But that's not how social media works, right? So Zuckerberg is not making a decision on how you should talk. But what you can say is that there's an indirect modulation of talk, or an indirect modulation of behavior, right? And then indirect modulation of representation as well, or self-representation. And it's essentially once people make sense of what are the rules of visibility, they will negotiate that rules of visibility through their behavior. So what I found in my fieldwork, I mean, it's impossible to summarize everything, but there's this sort of a fragmented and dispersed idea that people are radicalizing their discourse on social media to get more interactions, and with more interactions get more visibility. And I absolutely found that. So, and the interesting thing is that I didn't speak to Donald Trump. I spoke to absolutely ordinary people. So there is also an infiltration, the deep infiltration of this sort of a behavior, political behavior amongst ordinary people.
Sorry, just to jump in here, I think it was a really interesting point that you made about the aspiration that perhaps traditional legacy media has to represent the world. And I think this is a point that came up in our discussion, which we mentioned in the intro with Amber Frost on the Financial Times. Here you have a newspaper which does aspire to represent the world in a more or less comprehensive way. It's kind of a full picture. And of course, you don't have that in social media. This is hardly sort of the most groundbreaking point. But of course, it's interesting that describing the infrastructure, algorithms as the infrastructure of social media, because that really it illustrates one of the key points that, you know, we are users of social media. We interact with each other mediated through this infrastructure, but we're not the customers. Of course, the algorithms are a way to essentially to extract more data, which is then what is really being sold to advertisers, and that's how obviously all these social media companies have. This is the business model on which they're based. I mean, so I guess my question is, to what extent did the people that you spoke to perceive this or understand this, or to what extent were they kind of realistic about this idea that, yeah, you know, we get Facebook for free, but there must be a cost. There must be some sort of you know, nothing like this is, you know, comes for free.
Yeah, I don't think they really care.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of them knew that the sort of the essential or the crucial elements of the political economy of data on Facebook, but they didn't really care, because at the end of the day, one of the biggest problems with the discourse about privacy is that for many people, privacy doesn't. We know that it does. The kind of harm that, especially when you think at the collective level, and then how harms to privacy can become a crucial harm to democracy itself. But for people, they don't see exactly how my privacy is being harmed here, and it's something that for them it's just creepy. I think that's perhaps the best. That's how it surfaced during my interviews. People are extremely afraid not of having their privacy harmed, so to speak, but with sort of what kind of I think it's hard to describe it, because people, they describe in terms that are not necessarily about morality. It's about creepiness. It's like, who knows what's happening? So there's a huge uncertainty about what's going on behind the scenes, right? What's going on behind the screen. And they feel, I guess, quite, what's the right term for this? I think scared. I think it's the way people say it's like a horror movie, in the sense that how come that company knows so much about me, in the sense that look what they are offering me in terms of ads. But how, of course, and during my interview,
but it's a horror movie they want to keep watching, evidently.
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of puts them off, you know, to some extent, right? So many people, I think it raises questions, but it's not a question of, you see, about the business model. It's not a question about who is the client and who is the product here. It's more like, I would say, maybe the inequality of imbalance, right? So how they know so much about me and I don't know anything about them. And yeah, but you're right. I mean, it's not necessarily that some people are willing to stop and say, okay, this is getting too creepy for me. But the creepiness of how Facebook works, actually, it feeds into lots of conspiracy theories. That's something that my thesis doesn't touch on, but I think it's something that I'm doing research with a colleague now, and all sorts of conspiracy theories on how algorithms work, and it's absolutely pervasive. So one of the things that for a long time we thought it was fake, it was a myth, is that Facebook is listening to our conversations. So not sure if you saw that, but for many years, I would say like 5 years, people were saying, yeah, Facebook listens to our conversations, etc. And you have many people, including people who used to work at Facebook and now is critical of Facebook, going public and say, listen, this is bullshit, because Facebook has much more data about you than Facebook needs. So what's the point of even recording, getting this kind of really complex data that's hard to make sense of, etc. But now, I think 2 or 3 months ago, actually Facebook said that it was listening to some things, and it was maybe.
And this all via Facebook, or like via Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, or where's it? Where's it listening?
I don't remember exactly where they were getting the data from. And I don't think they said that explicitly. But my point is that one of the problems with those this kind of a media company, and I think it's not so different from, again, the TV from the 1970s, is that people, they don't understand how it works. And it's so powerful, it's so central for their life, that they keep trying to make sense of it. And the best way to reason about media is a conspiratorial reasoning. I think especially Facebook, the way it works, not only Facebook, of course, I'm talking about maybe Instagram or YouTube as well, any algorithmic social media. They give you all the time, they're giving you indications that they know a lot about you. But you never know when the indication is a mere coincidence and when the indication is, in fact, the product of a data-fied decision-making process. You see my point? So
do you think
it's a typical situation that conspiracy theories arise when you have tidbits of information that make you confused, and you just start to wonder, it cannot be a coincidence. And I got that a lot in my interviews. It cannot be a coincidence.
Yeah, I think it seems in many cases safe to assume that it's not a coincidence. That thing that you were talking about, that you're in Facebook Messenger or whatever, suddenly you get an advert related to it. It seems more likely to be the product of some algorithmic decision making than it does to be just a pure coincidence. But I guess this kind of leads on to maybe a bigger question, and something else that you're interested in your research, which is around politicization and around, I guess, how. So I guess maybe to frame the discussion a little bit do you think social media is politicizing people in a significantly different way than previously, or does it only basically strengthen existing political positions?
Yeah. So I think first it's important to understand what is politicization, right? So what is to become political? I think there's always many ways in which you become political. Well, politicization is a process that happens in your private life, talking to like a family member, happens in school, talking to people. But media has always been a very important element in that, because you get information from media. But what happens with social media is that social media is so pervasive. So now your friends are social media, your family members are social media, your school friends are on social media. And of course, media is on social media, right? So CNN is on social media. So what happens is that, so then when you try to understand what is to become political, it is it's a way of positioning yourself in an imagined moral map, if you will, right? So you don't know the kind of people that I spoke to before the 2013 events in Brazil, or before the beginning of the Brazilian political crisis. They kind of knew what was politics, but they didn't position themselves into this wider map of politics. And because of what were happening, they started to speak on Facebook. And when you start to speak, you start to get feedbacks, and by this really iterative process of talking and listening and getting feedbacks, etc., people start to understand who they are. And what happens is that when you this process, which happens, had always happened everywhere, or out, maybe not necessarily everywhere, but in different spheres of life, when this process happens on social media, what you have is a process of political becoming, if you will, that is incredibly shaped by the logics of algorithms, but not by the logics of the algorithms per se, but how people imagine those logics. That's a really important distinction. I'm not saying that the algorithms are the ones who are influencing those processes. Is how people imagine those logics and how they start to trying to negotiate the logics of visibility when they are speaking. So you say, so how exactly that changes? What I found in my research, it's quite concerning, and I think it goes or talks to a little bit on like what we were talking about, the responsibility aspect of it. What's apparently happening is that people realize that in order to be heard, which is a form of becoming political, right? In order to be heard, the first thing that they should do is to become visible, right? But to become visible on Facebook, you must comply with imagined rules that are not necessarily conducive to a democratic understanding of how you speak politically. So one of the things is, as I was saying before, is this idea that the only way to become visible is by silencing other people, right? Either by abusing other people or manipulating other people. So those other users, they will somehow interact with the way you speak, with your voice, and then you're going to get visible, and then you can somehow be heard as a citizen, right?
Right.
And
so
that
that thoughtful long post on Facebook or long thread that you do, being really balanced and equilibrated, isn't going to get you anywhere. So
exactly, yeah, and that's absolutely how you become political, right? So because it's not only a way of positioning yourself, or to put another way, the way you position yourself in this wider map of what being political means, you do that by talking, right? You do that by acting. It's a form of social practice. So on the one hand, so people, they feel pressure to silence other people. On the other hand, of course, there's a huge amount of self-censorship. What you can or cannot speak. That's connected to the content of what you're going to talk about. But it's also, as you just said, it's connected to how you talk. It's you might be the new Jürgen Habermas, but you're not going to speak as Jürgen Habermas on Facebook because
I think one was enough, really.
Visible, right?
I thought one was enough, personally. But anyway, I think we should move on to something specific, which is maybe a consequence of politicization. Maybe that's a question. Is the creation of what I guess is commonly referred to as filter bubbles a consequence of politicization? Is it a politicizing moment as well, that suddenly you find yourself in a filter bubble and that you are politicized in a certain direction? Or does it only confirm pre-existing worldviews? And I think I might just use this opportunity as well to make a little plug, because you make certain examples to the Brazilian case. You said earlier, suddenly in 2013, everyone's politicized and polarized. I think probably our listeners will be familiar with it, but if you aren't, it's worth going back and checking out some of the episodes we've done on Brazil. If you go on to Patreon or Podbean, you can click on some of the themes, click on Latin America, and you can see the episodes we've done there, where you'll get a little bit more of an understanding of the historical backdrop. I only raise this because I think it's worth not just understanding the specific case of Brazil, where suddenly there's this explosion of what seems to be politicization and polarization after 2013, but it's similar to certain things that happen elsewhere around the world, that suddenly there's this explosion of protest, for example, and you weren't really thinking about politics at all. You were just concerned with your own private life or whatever, and then suddenly there's people on the streets and you need to get involved and you want to understand what's going on. And after that moment of explosion, you suddenly get, you get a political understanding, and you suddenly get a political label, and you find out what side you're on. And so maybe, I guess the question then is, well, to return back to the question of filter bubbles, like what comes first? Is it the politicization or is it the filter bubble? How does this whole process work? And with in mind thinking about, what might be happening in Chile now, for example, or what, etc.
So I think I would begin by saying that I'm a huge critical of the very notion of filter bubble. That's a myth that has been proved many times over in empirical studies, that there's no such a thing as filter bubble. this is a very intuitive notion that was pushed by a guy in the beginning of the 2010s, Eli Pariser. And if you read his book, the book has absolutely zero data, right? So he's just, well, if the algorithms work in this way, that is the natural consequence. And I think the case of the filter bubble is a fascinating example of how people make sense of social media, because it's a beautiful slogan in a way, right? So filter bubble, you can imagine, it's a beautiful metaphor. So I think the first thing is that many studies have shown that actually people today, they have a much more varied, even on social media diet than people had before. And especially when you compare people that don't use social media and people who use social media, people who use social media are more exposed to things from, to information from different sides of the political spectrum than people who are just, let's say, watch Fox News or in Brazil, Global, etc. And there's a reason for that, is that because when you are on social media, I think the biggest problem of the understanding of the concept of filter bubble is that we are monoliths. Well, if you're a Democrat, the only thing that you care about is, I don't know, healthcare or Medicare for all or whatever. And actually, everyone is very multifaceted, right? So we have different understandings and different interests. So you might, and in addition to that, on social media, we don't only have, political friends. We have, your cousin who is actually conservative, and you maintain this relationship with your cousin not for political reasons, but because family reasons. You like the person, whatever. You're forced because it's a annoying cousin, whatever. And this guy will post things about political. We post things about politics that are coming from a completely different ideological point of view. So it's important to say that there is no such a thing as filter bubble. That doesn't mean that the Facebook's algorithm, they want to show you what you have shown before to the algorithm that you want. But what we want also change over time, right? So I can give you an example. So if you had asked me 2 years ago whether I supported the Lava Jato operation, the anti-corruption operation in Brazil, I would say that yes, I kind of do support. But today I don't support it anymore. And it's not because of Facebook, but it's because of all the developments and things that happened in Brazil. And now we know that that operation was itself the consequence of corruption. So when people, they get politicized, it's not because they don't get polarized, or polarized, maybe it's not even the right term. They don't get radicalized because of how what they see on Facebook, right? They get polarized or because how they get feedback on Facebook. Let's say if I post, as we were saying before, if I post a huge philosophical text on Facebook and no one actually cares, so what's the point of being me? What's the point of being that person? I want to be someone else. I want to be accepted. And people they start to modulate their behavior and modulate their subjectivity, right? That's an element that most of people, they want to avoid. Well, subjectivity, that goes into psychology, whatever. But that's how people, that's actually a realistic understanding of what's going on, is that people, they want to be heard and they will do anything, whatever is needed to be heard. And then you can say that the sort of algorithms, they come in, because if to be heard you need to be visible. So tell me what I need to make to be visible so I can be heard. But you were saying something that's absolutely important, and it's something that has been not forgotten, but people are not really looking into it. But I think in the past 10 years or so, we have seen a sort of an acceleration of politics. There's a Brazilian philosopher who calls that there's a rebirth of politics. His name is Paulo Arantes. I mean, he's a very interesting thinker, but he doesn't unpack what is that. And usually philosophers, they don't really care about media. But I think, and there's so many other things happening, right? So you have, of course, the deconstruction of the new liberal order, of the problems that somehow were created by 20 years of austerity or minimum state ideology, etc. But I think social media, they introject politics into our everyday life in a way that has never occurred before. So you don't have to like politics to be exposed to politics all the time. Essentially because social media is infiltrated into our everyday life. We are on social media when we are working. We are on social media when we are, in the bathroom. We are on social media when we are in a bar having drinks. So before we could just turn off. Okay, we're watching here. The TV program about politics, and I don't care about politics, so I would just switch the channel. But now that I think it became and is becoming increasingly harder to not think about politics. And of course, and in addition to that, is how politics connect people and make incredibly easy to organize. That happened, of course, in 2013 in Brazil. That's happening now in other. It will keep happening. So the way that politics, the way I think the social media, algorithmic social media, change politics is also making it so easy for outsiders to threat the order. So think of Bolsonaro again in Brazil. So this guy was a no one. He was on the fringe of democracy. He was a clown. Everyone was laughing at him. And thanks to, there's no other way. I mean, that's thanks to Facebook, thanks to WhatsApp, he became known. Because if he had to wait for the mainstream media or even his political party is nothing. In that sense he's different from Trump, for instance. And I don't know. I think it's like what happened in Brazil. You were talking about the 2013 event. I think the historical backdrop in Brazil is that as a country that doesn't have a lot of political mobilization in its past, despite, of course, all the things that were done. And suddenly, I was there. I was covering the 2013 protests. It was a huge shock. No one understood what was happening because it's very similar to what's happening now in Chile. There is no leader. How those guys are getting here? We were asking ourselves when we were in Brasilia, in the palaces, people were trying to break in the palaces. And it was just like sort of a phantom organization. So it was sort of a miracle, as if it was, I don't know, coming out of nowhere. And that, of course, that feeling was not only in Brazil that was happening, and it's not only now. And next year, somewhere else, that will happen again.
It seems to be like a major feature of our contemporary politics, these explosions of protest which are leaderless in Kuwait and so on. I mean, it's something that we've discussed a number of times on this podcast. We're going to continue doing so. Yeah. I think one of the interesting things, with the Brazilian case, and again, this is maybe generalizable, and is the question of, what is the nature of the politics that emerges from these protests, and in terms of its interaction with social media, and how that might create certain feedback loops or lead to the creation of certain political nucleuses. Put it this way, basically, is the politics that we see returning, is it class politics or is it culture wars? And I know that that's not the only two options available, but I think some of the people who've studied Brazil make this argument that the kind of polarization that we see isn't necessarily a sort of class polarization entirely. In many ways, it's a polarization on cultural lines, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, but that that you get antipetismo, which again, for anybody who's not familiar, check out the check out the past episodes we've done on this. But, basically the sort of hostility to the Workers' Party and by extension to the rest of the left, that becomes a main pole of attraction. And then you get, the left on the other side. But in many ways, it happens on social media, and it happens amongst different segments of the middle class, or even divisions within the middle class. So that you might get, for example, a teacher who is on the left, and you might get a small business owner on the right, or even people in the same sectors or types of work or whatever who find themselves people with the same background who might find themselves on the opposite side of the barricade. So it's not exactly class politics being played out; it's culture war in some way.
Yeah, I think I would just make a distinction between what exactly is driving that dynamic in Brazil. I think because I would just say that I don't think that the logic of social media or algorithm social media is what is. I think you're correct in saying that it's not about class, it's more about culture, so to speak. But I don't think it's connected with the logics of social media, because what's happening here now in the UK is that you have Jeremy Corbyn, who's using social media, but along very classic class lines, right? So he's essentially saying that, well, you have this posh candidate who is Boris Johnson, and we are here for the many, not the few. And so he is also, I think, what social media is driven by. Of course, I'm not the first one to say this, but it's driven by how you say, negative emotions, right? Emotions of injustice. And what kind of injustice is that? It comes with what kind of injustice people are able to mobilize and argue in a convincing way, right? So it's like, as I think Jeremy Corbyn does well here in the UK, and not only Jeremy Corbyn himself, but the momentum and all sorts of smaller leftist movements that are essentially social media movements. They are not a brick and mortar social movement as we knew before. I think in the case of the Brazilian situation, you're right. It's essentially because the Brazilian crisis was triggered not because of economic concerns, but because of corruption concerns. And corruption is something that in Brazil it's a concern of certain components of the middle class.
So actually, something which follows on from this, part of your work has been looking at how Corbyn was portrayed in mainstream media, as people call it, which again is a product of a certain fraction of the middle class in the UK, as in most places. What did you find in this study?
Yeah, so that's something that we did when Corbyn was getting into the leadership of the Labour Party. It's a work that I did with a professor and a PhD student, another PhD student at the LSE, and he was demonized. I was shocked because I was just getting here in the UK, being a Brazilian journalist, and I was essentially reading The Guardian, and I had this vision of the UK media as much more balanced and much more intellectualized than the Brazilian media or Brazilian newspapers, at least. And the kind of the way he was portrayed was not only based on disinformation, but was also based on hatred. People clearly hated him, and based essentially on an argument of class, right? So they were portraying him as a sort of a Leninist revolutionary that was going to. I think this past week, someone here said all those ghosts, they come back now during the current election. So they have lots of people saying that Corbyn will essentially implement a communist state, which is ridiculous, right? I think those things are very deep seated, and the UK elite, after 5 years living here, I would say that this is an incredibly racist and also, of course, classist society. But I didn't know that when we were doing that research.
I think Corbyn's portrayal it's been a good lesson in the way that I think the British media is quite lazy in looking for certain caricatures and certain I don't know, historical parallels which really don't fit in any way at all. But yeah, and as I said earlier, if only Corbyn were a Leninist, if only we were about to introduce communism. But I don't think that's really on the menu just yet. But I guess the question is, what do you? I mean, do you think it's possible to say anything about the effect of these portrayals on voters or on supporters for candidates? I mean, I guess how critical do you think people are when reading these stories about Corbyn or seeing these cartoons of him in a kind of revolutionary clothing or anything like that?
No, right. So I think I'm from a school of thought that what media say is what media say, but by no means it means that it equates with how people make sense of what media say, right? So that also goes to what we were talking in the beginning of about like fake news and disinformation and how the social panics about it. In reality, I'm not aware of any research that actually looked into how people negotiate or how people interpret the coverage, the way that the UK media have portrayed Jeremy Corbyn. So sort of the short answer is I don't know. But my feeling is that it cannot be so bad, right? So if you think of the results of the 2017 election and the way that he became very popular, especially with youngsters, I think, of course, most of the newspaper here in the UK, not most, but at least those who were extremely critical of Jeremy Corbyn, they were, of course, on the right side of the political spectrum. And I don't think there's a lot of young people reading the Daily Mail, right? So as far as I know, the Telegraph is in a very complicated financial situation as well. So I think maybe if there's an indirect effect, is how that might push the television, especially public service media, to also portray not necessarily Jeremy Corbyn, but the Corbyn movement in a way that's not completely faithful to what Corbyn is and what his movement wants to do.
So, I mean, we started with the question of blaming the media, and I think there's nowhere more clear than this. As you say, there's an element of unreality to people blaming the media or thinking, that the Daily Mail has some decisive influence over public opinion when, as you say, certainly younger people aren't reading it. People are reading fewer and fewer newspapers and treating people as sort of passive recipients of media messaging is problematic. And it's especially problematic in today's times, as you've well explained, in terms of the fragmentation and also the loss of authority of mainstream media institutions. I mean, maybe, and this is a question, some of the more hysterical stuff about Corbyn, calling, think he's a terrorist, or the whole anti-Semitism slur. It's so, the hysteria is probably a reflection of their own lack of authority, the lack of sense of traction that mainstream media has. If someone has to shout louder, it's because they're not being listened to, right? And so that's basically it. That's what's happening now. And I think it from a practical kind of left-wing point of view, you have to say, well, one, you can't expect the media to be on your side, and it's wrong to start off with that assumption that they will play fair. And secondly, don't overstate its importance. Don't overstate the mainstream media's importance. Maybe it's a tool there to be used when you can use it, and that's that.
Yeah, and I would say that people like Jeremy Corbyn, they of course, this guy has built a career criticizing the mainstream media. So for him, this is absolutely, as you're saying, I mean, this is not, this is exactly what he was expecting, maybe.
Yeah, no surprises.
In a way, it plays in his hands, right? He can come and say, look, they're demonizing me, as they actually are, or they were, and probably they are already with the new election. And what I found interesting is how they appropriate of those completely ridiculous criticism in their social media presence. So I think I don't remember when exactly, but I think Jeremy Corbyn did post on Facebook and Twitter sort of just demonstrating the ridiculous of how he is portrayed in the UK mainstream media. And then the people who don't read the Daily Mail, but they read what Jeremy Corbyn says on Facebook, they will laugh out of Daily Mail. So he uses it. Jeremy Corbyn is himself demonizing the media, but he transforms the media demonization into an advantage for him, I guess.
I guess the difficulty is always how you sort of balance between a kind of a very naive idea that the media is neutral and impartial and is not politically engaged, which is dangerous, and then the other extreme, which is that the media is responsible for all the failures in the left's political programs, and Labour didn't win the 27 election because of the media, or is giving it too much power and not saying that there's very real structural weaknesses in the British left and in many European and worldwide lefts. And I guess that's not an easy kind of path to tread.
Yeah, I think it's always complicated, but I would just like to stress that perhaps the biggest problem that we're facing now is not necessarily how mainstream media represents Jeremy Corbyn or Elizabeth Warren or whatever. It's the extreme simplification around fake news. I think this is the biggest problem. So we see lots of very intelligent people saying, for instance, that fake news is what put Bolsonaro in Brazil into power, or what put Donald Trump into power in the US. And if Boris Johnson wins here in the UK, be absolutely sure that people will say that people voted on Boris Johnson because he was lying on Facebook, or because there was a campaign on Twitter based on lies. I mean, of course, that's exactly the explanation that people have for Brexit. And that's simply misguided. That is myopic, and that's extremely dangerous, because if you if you had a magical wand and you could just make everyone say the truth, doesn't mean that bad people will not be able to convince people of doing bad things. I mean, of course, what is bad or not, it's always complicated, but you see my point. And I think this, as a media scholar, the more I see this discourse, the more I get delusional. I mean, this is not going anywhere, and it's very hard to convince people that accuracy is only one component of what is let's say, a democratic media environment.
Yeah, excellent stuff. As you say, it's not going away, and the UK election coming up, that's definitely the case. We're recording this on the day after Lula was released from jail, so it's not going anywhere in Brazil either. Yeah. And I think you've provided us an excellent guide, I think, to avoiding the twin pitfalls that George said a little bit earlier, of neither a naive view of the media nor a conspiratorial one, but emphasizing people's capacity to be agents, but also especially the sort of interactive nature that happens, that you're not just politicized because you're a passive recipient of messages sent to you, but that you become politicized through interacting, through trying to become visible, through arguing and arguing back. And maybe that's a good note to finish on, to re-emphasize the importance of actually having good political arguments. So thank you for joining us, João.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That was nice. I like that. That was interesting. Kind of got a bit, quite critical actually of some received notions. I mean, even the idea of filter bubbles, which I had just taken as read as being a real thing. João was pretty critical of that.
Yeah, I guess it's quite easy to overstate it, isn't it? And to say, look, we're all people sort of self-flagellate, and it's like, oh, I need to get out of my echo chamber, and that's why I follow 5 people that I don't agree with on Twitter, and they make my outlook a lot
I get angry at them and then decide to unfollow them.
No, I really respect them. I respect what they have to. I might not agree with them, but I respect the way that they put forward their case with intellectual probity. I mean, yeah, I think it is another dimension of the sort of the moral panic around fake news, that there's essentially, this is not necessarily the most original point either, that it's it exaggerates the extent to which people are influenced. Well, not me, other people always are influenced by what they read and by the constraints that are applied on what they receive and how they, I guess, come to see various different points of view in the media.
Yeah, and also the interactional aspect that I tried to kind of recapitulate there at the end, I think is important. The idea that and I think intuitively this makes sense. In fact, someone made a great point.
I have to say, I did think that, sorry to interrupt there, but that's a good example of interaction. I did think that was all going to be a plug for interacting with this episode or interacting with the podcast. You were like, interaction's really important, and that's why you should like it,
right, listener. No.
Get on the Patreon, add some comments, get interacting.
Yeah. No, what I meant is in the process of politicization. Point that Angela Nagel made when we were discussing the Zizek versus Peterson episode, debate. It was an episode that we did on that, where she pointed it out. But I think it's right. Is that especially young men try out arguments, and often you'll seize on a quite extreme form of argument. And you'll test it out, and it'll, you might prove wrong. I mean, I can think about that as like, as a kid, as whatever, like being 15, and you seize on an argument and you follow it to such, and then you realize like, actually, that's a fairly weak argument because I wasn't able to really sustain my argument, and you roll back on that and you change course and whatever. And actually, that's kind of more the process of politicization than is. I read this argument on Twitter and I was like, whoa, mind blown. It's actually more that you hear that argument on Twitter and you go, and you try it out with a friend then in the bar and they go, no, that's bullshit. Or they go, that's interesting. So you push it a little bit further. And again, it's an interactional process in which you actually have some agency there. You're not just a receptacle for messages sent by other people who already have their ideas made up.
Yeah, no, I think that is an interesting and important point, that rather than just being brainwashed and you read one thing, believe that, you read another thing, you believe it. It's almost dialectical, isn't it? It's the way in which you're putting forward ideas, receiving feedback on them, and then developing the way that you see the world. But I think that's only one element of it. Of course, the media is important for politicization, but you also have the material circumstances you're in and the sorts of problems that your everyday life and particularly your working life presents you. So I think it's important that we do I guess appreciate the extent to which that the greater interaction in social media is useful, but it's obviously not the only mechanism of politicization. But yeah,
right. People look for a language to make sense of their grievances, right? And so those grievances are real and they're material and they're tied to material relations and experiences that people have in their real lives, not just in media. But the language through which they are able to express that is something that they will often pluck from the ether, as it were. And so that's where politics comes in, right? Because it's not politics is not just social grievances thrown onto the world. In fact, some of these protests that we get nowadays that we were just referring to during the episode, we talked about most recently with Chile, are often moments of grievances just spilling out, but then they need to take political form. They need to be put into a specific kind of political language and given some kind of political coherence. And that's where arguments come in. And that's where, media comes in. That's where reading books comes into it, and that's important. I think that's where that kind of transition often gets lost. It's either just pure grievance or it's politicization on social media, and the kind of mediation between those two things is what's forgotten. So yeah, you're right to draw attention to that. Exactly.
No, I think that's it's a really valid point, that particularly since 2016 there have been it feels at least like there have been a lot more grievances which are very inchoate, and people are, in my account, it would be responding to the felt loss of popular sovereignty is one of the key things. But what that actually means, the meaning of those grievances and the directions which they're channeled into, is quite open. And that's of course why people look to the sorts of media outlets which might represent or claim to represent those grievances and then mistakenly attribute the politicization to those areas, whereas in fact they're just obviously reflecting in a success because of the prior politicization.
So yeah, I mean the direction that gets taken in, the actual politics that you end up hanging your grievance coat on, to use a really poor metaphor, it's up for grabs. But when you, for example, I mean something that we've talked about a lot, downwardly mobile middle class who feels increasingly squeezed, who feels that they don't have the same opportunities that their parents or that their grandparents had, that the opportunities are being closed. Then you seize on to different grievances, and one kind of misconceived way might be through identity, right? That you see this as whatever, this is white men doing it to you, rather than it being the operations of capitalism today. But that's important because I think a lot of what ends up happening today, that what feels like the return of politics, ends up being warped or perverted into a kind of culture wars language of kind of shrieky moralistic arguments where agencies are attributed to like some malevolent group without a kind of real structural understanding, and which ends up not being real class politics. It ends up being a form of culture war, but because it might adopt certain symbols of class politics or of powerful and powerless, of inequality of the rich and the poor, it seems like it's class politics, but it might not quite be that yet.
So people are wearing the wrong grievance coats, if you will.
No, you can't change the grievance. The grievance coat's just there. It's natural. Maybe it's your grievance skin. It depends what. No, this is just. That's not going to work.
No, I think it's a good point in terms of what is the media's role in this. You might say that the recent politicizations not being generally expressed in class terms. It seems like there's something to unpick there about how the media is involved in a much wider sort of failure of the left to kind of offer material responses in general to recent political problems.
Well, and this is the thing where the ghosts come back, which is something that João said, right? That they often feel like you're repeating the 1970s and the slander of Corbyn, and the trying to say like, oh, he's whether he's like an IRA terrorist or he's a Hezbollah or what, I mean, it's all these things which are symbols which surely don't make much sense to people today, other than saying this is scary and something bad and you shouldn't pay attention to this. But there's also,
I think you've been reading too much Derrida if you're talking about ghosts coming back, maybe.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, these kind of symbols which like have lost their real reference. I was even reading something the other day about the use of or the repeating of kind of like Irish Republican slogans in Ireland today by a generation who never experienced the trouble. So that people would be like up the ra or whatever, right? And there are kind of memes around this and stuff. And it made me think like this is also a funny case of maybe people trying to seek out provocative political symbols of rebellion and radicalism, and only being able to plumb a past which doesn't really relate to contemporary concerns, contemporary struggles. So you see the kind of mainstream establishment doing it as a way to kind of scare people off, and so they have to refer to weird Cold War type things or try to reheat the Cold War through Russiagate. But you also get it on the left as well, that we kind of grasp for these old symbols, or this kind of cosplaying Stalinism that you get as well, where you're like, I'm going to send you to the gulag, and it's like it makes no sense to today's politics, and yet there's obviously like clearly a lack of new political symbols being created, new political language to express these contemporary grievances, because otherwise you wouldn't be cosplaying as a Stalinist or whatever the fuck you might be doing.
No, I think that's quite a striking image, microwaving the Cold War leftovers, trying to reheat them.
Nice.
But yeah, that's always the difficulty of any revolutionary project that needs to take its poetry and its symbols from the future, not the past. It's not a very easy thing to do, to just come up with a new political language or new political sort of set of reference, which you can then express the conflicts of the day in. But yeah, no, I think just narrowly on the British case, it is and I think I made this point in the interview, it's just quite striking how little imagination there is. Political cartoonists particularly illustrate this, I think. There's but Private Eye has become, in my opinion, quite a lot less funny in the past few years because there's not really any cutting edge to some of the 70s comparisons that are made, and Corbyn in particular. I don't think they're very good at skewering him and very good at kind of finding amusing things about him, because they're looking in the wrong places and they're comparing him to the wrong things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's actually the only place where the riposte "Okay, Boomer" actually makes any sense. Your symbols don't apply here anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes me think that Hegel was the original Boomer, right? He thought everything was fine and everything was for the best in the Prussian constitutional monarchy of the day. So he's the original Boomer in mindset, if not in time.
Marx was the first "Okay, Boomer" response.
Yeah.
And that's an awful note to end it on, but that is where we will end it. Thanks everyone for listening. Once again, follow us and interact with us on social media at Bungacast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And if you haven't left us a review yet and you like what we say, you like what we do, leave us a review. You can also leave us a negative review, because that makes the whole process seem that much more authentic. Thank you very much. Catch you later. Bye bye.